There is a line in the incident file that everyone agrees on. An iceberg under tow rolled without warning in Davis Strait. The vessel towing it was laid over by the wave. 4 men went into the water, and one of them did not come out. I want to be careful here, because that sentence is true. Every word of it is true. Rotting icebergs roll. It is the single best documented hazard in icework, and it is the reason that every person who does that job for a living treats a berg the way you would treat a loaded gun with no safety. A berg floats with roughly 7/8 of itself underwater, and as it melts unevenly, and the day comes when the shape below the waterline can no longer hold the shape above it upright. When that happens, there is no warning, and there is no sound. A wall of ice the size of an office block simply turns over, and it throws a wave off itself as it goes, and anything floating nearby goes with it. And the water in Davis Strait in late summer sits a degree or 2 above freezing. A man in that water has minutes. Not hours. Minutes. So when the file says an iceberg rolled and a man was lost, the file is not hiding anything, and it is not wrong. It is a complete and accurate account of an accident that happens in that part of the world. Here is the only thing it does not explain. 40 hours before the berg rolled, the same vessel put a call out over the radio. The call is in the traffic log because radio traffic in that part of the world gets logged, and the log is not a secret and never was. A man's voice, quiet, reading out a position. And then the man says that there's something inside the ice. He does not say a fish. He does not say a whale. He says a shape. And then he says a size. And then there is a long gap in the recording where nobody says anything at all. That gap is about 11 seconds. I have listened to it more times than is good for me. You can hear the deck under him, and you can hear wind across the microphone, and you can hear, faintly, somebody else on that deck saying one word, twice. And then the first man comes back on and asks whether anybody else is close enough to come and look. Nobody was. That is the story I want to tell you, and I am going to tell it in the order the crew lived it, which means there are things I'm going to hold back until the end, because they did not know them yet either. But I will tell you the shape of it now, so you know what you are watching. 4 men went into that water. 3 came out. And the reason anybody can say anything at all about what was in the ice is that in order to tow an iceberg, you first have to measure it. They measured that berg very carefully. They had to. And the numbers they wrote down to move a piece of ice are the only ruler anybody has ever managed to put next to this animal. Before I get into any of it, I want to ask you something. And I am asking because the answers genuinely change how I write these. If you have ever worked cold water for a living, or even been on it, I want to hear about it in the comments. Not the weather. The way it makes you behave. Because everybody I have spoken to for this story talks less about being afraid than about being careful in a way that becomes a habit. And I think people who have done it will know exactly what I mean. The vessel was a stern trawler called the Atlantic Meridian. 241 feet on the registry, which is about 73 meters, built in the late 1980s, refitted twice. She was a factory boat, which means she did not just catch fish, she processed and froze them on board, and that matters more than it sounds like it should. A factory boat stays out. She is not running back to port every few days with a hold full of ice and fish. She works aground until the freezers are full, and that means she is a small, self-contained town sitting on top of some of the coldest and least visited water on the planet for weeks at a time. The ground she was working was the western side of Davis Strait, off the Greenland coast, in the deep water where the Greenland halibut are. If you have not been up there, the thing to understand about Davis Strait is that it is not empty. That is the mistake people make. They see the map. They see a cold, blank channel between Greenland and Baffin Island, and they assume there is nothing in it. In fact, it is one of the more productive stretches of water in the Northern Hemisphere. Cold water holds more dissolved oxygen than warm water. The current systems up there drag nutrients up off the bottom. There are halibut down deep, there is capelin, there are seals in numbers, and there are whales working the same water for the same reasons the boats are. It is a larder. It is a very cold, very dark, very poorly observed larder. And I want you to hold on to that phrase, because we are going to come back to it. The other thing in that water is ice. Every summer, the Greenland glaciers on the western side calve into the fjords, and the fjords feed into Baffin Bay, and Baffin Bay feeds south into Davis Strait, and the ice comes down that channel in a slow parade that has been going on for longer than anybody has been watching it. Some of it is small enough to ignore. Some of it is the size of a building. A working crew up there is looking at ice on the radar all day and all night, the way you would look at traffic. Which is the only reason anybody noticed this one at all. It was on the radar as a large target, and it was on the radar as a large target that was not behaving quite the way the ones around it were behaving. It was riding slightly low. That is in the log, in the mate's handwriting, before any of the rest of it. Riding low. The mate was a man named Danny Rask. He was 31. He had been going north since he was 19, and he was the one with the camera. Not a film crew, not a documentary, nothing like that. A crewman with a compact camera he kept in a dry bag in his jacket, because he had got into the habit of photographing weather and ice and anything else that would make people at home believe him. Most of what he shot is the most boring footage you will ever see. Gray water. Gray sky. Men in orange working a deck. And then there is about 6 minutes of something else. They came up on it in the early morning, in that long, flat Arctic light that never really commits to being daytime. A tabular berg, which means flat-topped, the kind that comes off an ice shelf or a large glacier front and sits in the water like a table. Big. Not the biggest thing they had ever seen, but big enough that the skipper slowed the boat, which is what you do. And the first thing anybody noticed was not the shape at all. It was the color. Old sea ice and glacier ice go blue. That is real, and it is not a trick of the light. Ice that has been compressed for a long time has had the air squeezed out of it, and ice without air scatters light differently. And the blue you get out of a big old berg is one of those colors that photographs badly and does not look real when you see it in person either. This berg had a face on the northern side that was almost clear. Clear enough that Rask, standing at the rail with a camera, could see into it. And what he could see was a dark shape. I want to be very careful about how I describe this, because everything that follows depends on you understanding what a person can and cannot see through ice. He did not see a shark. He saw a darkness inside a blue wall, held maybe 15 or 20 feet in, softened at the edges the way a thing at the bottom of a swimming pool is softened. He said later, and this is the part I keep coming back to, that his first thought was that it was rock. Bergs pick up debris. A glacier grinds along the ground for miles before it reaches the sea, and it carries what it grinds. And it is completely ordinary to find gravel and boulders and dirt frozen into a berg. So the first explanation was the boring one, and the boring one was reasonable, and everybody on that deck accepted it for something like 20 minutes. The second explanation was better, and it was also wrong. Somebody on the deck said it was a whale. And here is why that was not a stupid thing to say. Whales do get caught in ice up there. It happens often enough that Greenlandic has a word for it. The word is savsat, and it describes what happens when a pod of whales is working an area of open water and the ice closes behind them, and they end up trapped in a shrinking hole, breathing in a space that is getting smaller. It has been documented for well over a century. Beluga, narwhal, sometimes larger animals, sometimes hundreds at a time. So a crew looking at a dark mass in the ice off Greenland and saying whale are not reaching for something exotic. They are reaching for the local, ordinary, well-documented answer. And if you had been standing on that deck, you would probably have said it too. That explanation lasted until the shape moved. I want to be precise about this because it is the hinge of the whole thing. On the footage, the shape does not swim. It does not surge. It does not turn. It does nothing dramatic. Over the course of about 4 seconds, it shifts slightly along its own length in a way that a mass of rock frozen into ice cannot do, and a carcass suspended in ice cannot do either. And then it is still again. Rask says a word off camera, which I am not going to repeat. The camera drops to the deck and comes back up, and for the rest of the footage, he does not move it off that spot. Now, this is the point where I want you to do something for me, because you have exactly as much information as the crew had at this moment, and I would genuinely like to know where your head goes. You have seen a dark mass held inside a berg off Greenland, and you have seen it move. You have no measurements yet. Nobody does. Tell me in the comments what you think it is. Not what you want it to be. What you actually think it is, standing on that rail with what you have got. I am going to come back to your answer near the end, because there is a specific moment in this story where the crew ran out of ordinary explanations, and I want to see whether you run out at the same place they did. The decision they made next is the one people argue about, and it is the one I found hardest to understand until I understood the job. They decided to take it with them. Put like that, it sounds insane. A fishing boat does not tow icebergs. But look at what was actually in front of them. They had a thing that nobody was going to believe. They had footage, and Rask knew better than anybody how little footage is worth, because he had spent years shooting weather that looked like nothing when he showed it to people at home. They had a berg that was already melting and would be gone inside a season. And they had a piece of equipment on the back of that boat that is genuinely capable of moving very heavy objects through water, because that is what a troll winch does for a living. There is also a piece of context that surprises most people. Towing icebergs is a real job. It has been a real job for decades. Off Newfoundland, where the same ice comes down the same alley a few weeks later, the oil industry runs iceberg management as a standing operation, because a berg drifting down onto a production platform is a catastrophe, and moving the berg is cheaper than moving the platform. They do it with a rope around the berg and a supply vessel and a great deal of patience. Greenland ice is also genuinely a thing people harvest and sell. In small quantities for novelty, but the practice exists. So the idea of putting a line on a piece of ice and pulling it somewhere is not a mad idea invented by a trawler crew at 4 a.m. It is a thing that gets done. Their plan was not to bring it to a city. Their plan was to get it into a shallow fjord on the coast where it would ground itself in cold water and sit there, out of the current, while somebody with more authority than a trawler mate came and looked at it. That was maybe 2 days of towing. The skipper was a man named Ivar Solheim, and by every account I have of him, he was not a romantic and not a fool. He had 22 years of that water. His argument, as it comes down to us, was simple, and it was about money and reputation in roughly equal measure. If the thing in the ice was nothing, they would have lost 2 days of fishing and would look slightly silly. If it was something, then 2 days was nothing at all. The man who argued against him was Rask. This is the detail that stayed with me longest, because Rask is also the man who filmed it, and the man who has spent the years since being asked about it. The mate who wanted it left alone is the reason we have any of it. His objection was not about danger, at least not at first. His objection was that they did not know what they had, and that towing an unknown thing behind a boat for 2 days is a decision you cannot take back once you have taken it. He lost the argument. I want to be fair to Solheim here, because it is very easy from a warm room to say the skipper was reckless. Every part of that decision was defensible on the morning he made it. The berg was stable. They surveyed it, and it was stable. They had the gear. The weather window was good and getting better. And they were not planning to take it anywhere except into shelter. The one thing he was wrong about is a thing that nobody on that deck had any way of knowing. And I am going to come back to it in the third part of this, because it is the reason all of this ends the way it does. Now we get to the part of the story that turns it from an anecdote into something you can actually argue with. Because before you can tow a berg, you have to know what you are towing. This is not optional, and it is not a formality. If you put a line on a piece of ice and you have underestimated its mass, one of 2 things happens. Either the line parts, which at those loads can take a man's legs off, or the berg does not move and the boat does, and you spend fuel dragging your own stern sideways. So the crew did what anybody in ice management does, and they surveyed it. 3 measurements, all of them ordinary. The first was waterline length, off the radar. Radar sees the berg as a target, and the target has a width, and you run the boat down its length, and you read it. They put the waterline length at 310 feet, which is a little over 90 meters. That is a substantial berg, but it is not a famous one. The second measurement was sail height, which is the part above the water, and they got that with a small drone that the boat carried for looking at ice and gear. They put the sail at 90 feet, about 27 meters. The third number is not a measurement at all, it is arithmetic, and it is the most famous piece of arithmetic in the whole of icework. Ice floats with roughly 1/8 of itself above the water. Roughly 7/8 is below. That ratio is not a rule of thumb somebody made up. It comes straight out of the density of ice against the density of seawater. And while the exact figure moves around with how much air and sediment the ice is carrying, it is close enough that every person who works ice uses it. So a sail of 90 feet implies a draft of something in the region of 600 feet. And with a length and a draft and a rough idea of the shape, you can put a number on the mass. Their working figure was in the region of 1.5 million tons. I want to let that sit for a second, because people hear iceberg and they picture a hazard, and they do not picture the actual object. 1.5 million tons. That is the thing they put a rope on. And the last number is the one that becomes important later, and it is the one I find most useful, because it is the only one that was being taken continuously rather than once. A trawl winch has a tension readout. It has to, because the whole business of towing a net through water is a business of managing load. So from the moment the line came tight, the Atlantic Meridian was recording, minute by minute, exactly how hard she was pulling and exactly how hard the ice was pulling back. That log survived. Everything I am going to tell you in the last part of this story sits on top of that log and on top of a hull length that is printed on a public registry and on nothing else. Those numbers were written down to move a piece of ice. Nobody wrote them down to measure an animal. That is exactly why they are worth anything at all. Now I have to deal with the objection that you have almost certainly been sitting on since the first minute of this, because if I do not deal with it properly, then nothing else I say is worth listening to. How does a living animal end up inside an iceberg? And I want to be blunt about the version of that question that is not worth answering, because it is the version that gets this story dismissed. Nothing was frozen. There is no animal in this story that was locked in solid ice and came back to life. That does not happen, and it cannot happen. A large animal is mostly water, and when water freezes, it makes crystals, and those crystals do to a body what broken glass would do to it. Freezing kills large animals, and it kills them permanently. If anybody tells you a story about a shark frozen in a glacier for 10,000 years and waking up, you can stop listening to that person, and I would rather lose you here for being boring than keep you by telling you something stupid. What was in that berg was not in ice. It was in water. Here is the part that people find hard to believe, and that is nevertheless completely ordinary if you have ever been close to one of these things. An iceberg is not a block. We draw it as a block because that is how you draw it on a diagram, and the diagram has done a lot of damage to how people picture the real object. A berg in open water is a rotting structure. Warmer seawater works at it from below and from the sides, and it does not work evenly, and it opens channels. Bergs develop caves. They develop arches and tunnels and undercuts at the waterline and holes that go in and do not come out. Photographers go and shoot the arches. because an arch in a berg is a genuinely spectacular thing, and every one of those arches is a hole that the sea made by finding a weakness and following it. Below the waterline, where nobody is photographing, the same process is happening more aggressively, because that is where the warmer water is. So the honest picture of a large berg is not a cube of ice. It is closer to a rotten tooth, solid at a glance and riddled once you look. Now put a big animal in that water. That water is cold, but it is also full of food. And there is one other thing a berg does that matters here. A berg drags a plume of cold, fresh meltwater with it, and that plume changes the water around it, and it concentrates things. Seals work the ice. Fish work the ice. Bergs are not empty water, they are structure, and in an ocean, structure gathers life the way a hedge gathers birds. An animal that goes into an undercut or a submerged channel in a berg is not doing anything strange. It is doing what any large predator does around structure. It is going in after something. And then the berg does what bergs do, which is shift. It does not have to roll all the way to trap something. It has to settle once by a few degrees and close a way out that a body its size can pass through. The water inside does not go anywhere, because the water inside is seawater that was already there. I want to be very clear about that, because it is the whole ball game. That pocket is not ancient. It is not 10,000-year-old glacial ice melted into a bath. It is seawater from that summer, from that sea, that was outside the berg one day and inside it the next, because the ice moved around it. Days. Weeks at the outside. Not centuries. That is why nothing in this story requires you to believe anything about suspended animation or ancient survival. And it is why I have been careful with every sentence in this section. The animal was not preserved. It was shut in. I want to step off the science for a moment, because there is something about that first day that I think is more revealing than any of the measurements. The crew stopped talking about it. That is not what you would expect. You would expect a boat full of men who had just found the strangest thing any of them had ever seen to talk about nothing else for 2 days, and for the first few hours, that is exactly what happened. And then, according to all 3 of the accounts I have, it went quiet. Not tense. Quiet. The cook has been quoted saying that the galley on the first evening was the most normal it had been all trip, and that this struck him as strange at the time and stranger afterwards. Men talked about the weather and about gear and about a football result somebody had picked up on the radio. Nobody said the word shark. There is a kind of superstition in that work that people who have not done it tend to romanticize, and I do not want to do that here. I do not think those men were frightened of a curse. I think they had all independently arrived at the same position, which is that they did not have a name for what was behind the boat, and that saying a name out loud would commit them to it. So they did not. What they did instead was go and look at it. That is the detail that matters, and it is the one that becomes important at 2:20 in the morning on the 3rd day. Over those 2 days, men who had no reason to be on deck kept finding reasons to be on deck. They went out in 1s and 2s, at the ends of watches, in the dark, and they stood at the rail and looked at the ice. Nobody logged that because there is nothing to log. It was the most human thing anybody did on that trip, and it is the reason the number of men in the water was 4 instead of 1. Which leaves the second objection, and this one is better. I have had it put to me by people who know a great deal more about sharks than I do, and it is the reason I spent longer on this film than I meant to. Forget the ice. Forget the berg. How does an animal like this live in water that is 2 degrees above freezing at all? Because everybody knows what a megalodon was. It was a warm water animal. It lived in warm, shallow seas. Its teeth turn up in warm water deposits, and the standard account of why it is not here anymore is that the oceans changed and the warm shelf seas it depended on went away. That is the mainstream account. And I am not going to strawman it because it is well argued and it is probably right about the extinction. But there is a piece of that account that has been quietly falling apart for years, and once you know about it, the Arctic stops being the least likely place for this animal and starts being one of the more interesting ones. Sharks are supposed to be cold-blooded. Most of them are. A shark generally runs at the temperature of the water it is in, which is why most large sharks are found where the water suits them. But there is a family that broke that rule a long time ago. They are called the lamnids, and you know all of them. The great white, the mako, the porbeagle, the salmon shark. Those animals are what is called regionally endothermic, which is a technical way of saying that they make their own heat and they keep it. The mechanism is a heat exchanger. The blood coming back from the swimming muscle is warm because working muscle is warm. And instead of taking that warm blood to the gills and dumping the heat into the sea, these animals run the outgoing and incoming blood vessels alongside each other in a dense bundle, and the heat crosses over from one to the other before it can be lost. The name for that bundle is Arita mirabile, which translates as wonderful net, and for once the anatomists were not overselling. It means a great white can hold its swimming muscle, its stomach, its eyes, and its brain well above the temperature of the water it is swimming in. Not the whole body. Regions of it. Hence, regionally endothermic. Now, 2 of those 4 animals are not warm water animals at all. The porbeagle is a North Atlantic cold water shark. It works water off Iceland, off Norway, off Greenland, in temperatures that would put most sharks into a coma. The salmon shark does the same thing in the subarctic North Pacific, and it does it in numbers. These are not freak individuals that wandered north. These are populations that live there, hunt there, and are adapted to be there. And the thing that lets them do it is the heat exchanger. And then there is the animal that makes the whole objection collapse, which is the Greenland shark. The Greenland shark lives its entire life in Arctic water, at or near freezing, in the dark, and it grows to great white size and beyond. It is not a lamnid, and it does not have the heat exchanger. It solved the problem a different way, by being extraordinarily slow and extraordinarily long-lived. The point is not that a Greenland shark is anything like the animal in this story. The point is much simpler than that. Cold water does not stop a shark being enormous. There is a very large shark living in the coldest water in the northern hemisphere right now, and nobody thinks that is remarkable because we have known about it for 200 years. So we have established that sharks can be warm-bodied, and we have established that warm-bodied sharks live in cold water, and we have established that cold water does not cap the size of a shark. That leaves the specific question. What about this animal? And here I have to be careful again, because I am going to tell you about a piece of real research, and I do not want to overstate what it says. You cannot take the temperature of an extinct animal. There is no thermometer you can put in a fossil. What you can do is read the chemistry of its teeth. Tooth enamel forms at body temperature, and the ratio of certain isotopes locked into that enamel as it forms depends on how warm the animal was when it laid it down. That is a real technique. It is used on other extinct animals, and in recent years it has been turned on Megalodon teeth and compared against teeth from sharks living in the same waters at the same time. The published result argues that this animal was carrying a body temperature several degrees above the sea around it. That it was, like its cousins, regionally endothermic. I want to say clearly what that is and what it is not. It is an inference from chemistry. It is argued in the literature, and it is contested in the literature, the way everything in that field is contested. It is not a measurement anybody took from a living animal, and I am not going to pretend it is. But it is real work, published by real people, and it is now part of the standard conversation about what this animal was. And here is the inversion that I could not stop thinking about once I saw it. The way that finding usually gets used is as an explanation for the extinction. The argument runs like this. A warm body is expensive. You have to feed it constantly. An animal that size, running warm, needs an enormous and reliable supply of large prey. And when the oceans reorganized and the warm shelf seas shrank and a leaner competitor turned up in the shape of the great white, the bill came due and the animal could not pay it. That is a good argument. I think it is probably right about what happened to the species. But look at what that argument is actually saying. It is saying that this animal's problem was not the cold. Its problem was the cost. The very trait that makes a warm body a liability in a shrinking warm ocean is the trait that makes it viable in a cold one, provided the cold one is full of food. And a cold ocean full of food is not a hypothetical. It is a description of the water the Atlantic Meridian was fishing. The thing everybody reaches for to explain why this animal died is the thing that would let a remnant of it live in exactly the place nobody has ever gone looking. Because that is the last piece, and it is the one that made me uncomfortable. Why do we say Megalodon was a warm water animal? We say it because that is where the teeth are. And where are the teeth? The teeth are in the places where the rock is exposed, where the deposits are accessible, where the water is shallow enough and the coastline is developed enough that people have been walking around picking things up for 200 years. Florida, the Carolinas, Malta, Peru. The teeth are where the paleontologists are, and the paleontologists are where it is possible to be. Nobody has ever conducted a systematic search for this animal's remains under the Arctic seafloor, because it would be absurdly difficult, and because nobody expected to find anything. That is not evidence of absence. That is an absence of looking. I am not telling you the animal is there. I'm telling you that the reason we are all so certain it could not be is thinner than it sounds. Let me get back on the boat, because I have left 4 men towing an iceberg for rather a long time. The tow started on a Tuesday morning, and the plan was 2 days. The first day was, by every account I have, extremely boring. That is worth saying because the story you are being told has a shape, and the shape makes it feel like everything happened at once. And it did not. They made about 3 knots. 3 knots is walking pace for a person who is not in a hurry. The berg came along behind them, enormous and slow, and the winch tension log shows exactly the kind of numbers you would expect, rising and falling gently with the swell. The crew did what crews do, which is stop being amazed at something after about 4 hours of looking at it. Except for Rask. The thing that everybody who has talked about that day mentions is that Rask stopped sleeping. He was on deck at the end of his watch, and he was on deck at the start of it, and he had the camera, and he was looking at the ice. He has said since that he was not frightened at that point, and I believe him. He has said that what he felt was closer to responsibility. He was the one who had seen it move. He was the one who had argued against the tow and lost. And now the thing was on the end of a rope behind his boat for 2 days, and he had worked out something that nobody else on that deck seemed to have worked out, which is that the berg was going to keep melting the entire time. They picked up a witness on the second morning, and this is the piece of the story that I think carries the most weight, precisely because the man had nothing to do with any of it. A coastal freighter called the Nordkapp Trader came up on them from the south, on passage, and overtook them at a distance of something under a mile. Her master was a man named Peter Lindqvist, and he had been running that coast for 11 years. He saw a trawler towing an iceberg, which is an unusual enough thing to see that he did what anybody would do. He got his camera out. Lindqvist's photographs are the reason this story is not just a cruise word. They are not dramatic. That is what makes them useful. They show a stern trawler at distance, low in a gray sea, with a berg behind her. And in 3 of the frames, the berg's clear face is toward the camera, and there is a dark mass inside it. He has been consistent about what he thought at the time, and what he thought at the time was that he was looking at a rock in the ice. He did not radio them. He did not think it was worth radioing about. He photographed it because it was odd, and he carried on south, and he did not think about it again until a long time afterwards when somebody came asking. I find him more persuasive than any of the men on the Meridian, for exactly that reason. He had no stake in it. He was not on that deck at 4 a.m. with his heart going. He took a picture of something odd on his way past and got on with his day. The other outside witness is a different kind of person, and she is more useful still and more frustrating. Her name is Marit Ellingson, and she is an ice management surveyor. The Meridian sent their survey numbers off the boat during the tow, because Solheim, whatever else he was not an idiot, and he wanted somebody who did this professionally to tell him whether the tow was sane. Ellingson got waterline length, sail height, an estimated draft, an estimated mass, and a description of the berg's shape and condition. She has confirmed every one of those numbers. She has confirmed she received them, confirmed they are consistent with each other and with the photographs, and confirmed that the mass estimate was a reasonable working figure for a berg of those dimensions. She will not say one word about the animal. Not that it was not there. Not that it was. Her position, and I think it is an entirely honorable one, is that she was asked to assess an iceberg, and she assessed an iceberg, and everything else is outside what she can speak to. I want you to notice what that gives us, because it is unusual and it is worth more than an enthusiastic witness would be. The measurements stand on their own. They do not need the creature, and they do not vouch for the creature. A professional with no interest in this story has confirmed the ruler. Which brings me to the objection that beat me, and I want to put it to you at full strength because it is the correct objection and because until the last day of that tow it was unanswerable. Ice distorts. Everything I have described so far, every observation, every judgment about size, was made by looking through between 15 and 20 feet of glacial ice. And ice is not glass. It has a different refractive index from air and from water. It is full of trapped air bubbles and sediment plains and internal cracks, and light coming through it bends and scatters and does not travel in a straight line. Anybody who has looked into a big berg will tell you that scale inside it is a liar. Things look bigger. Things look closer. Things look like other things. So a skeptic looks at Rask's footage and at Lindqvist's photographs and says, reasonably, that a dark mass seen through 20 feet of blue ice could be a shark of perfectly ordinary size, or a rock, or a mass of compacted sediment, and that the reason it looks impossible is that ice makes things look impossible. And at the end of the second day of that tow, that skeptic is winning. That is where the evidence sits. A moving shape, 2 independent sightings, a set of confirmed measurements of the ice, and one very good reason not to trust any judgment of size made through it. The berg rolled at 2:20 the following morning. I told you earlier that there was one thing Solheim was wrong about, and that nobody on that deck had any way of knowing it. This is it. Towing an iceberg makes it melt faster. Not by a little. When a berg is drifting, it moves with the water around it, and the water against its face is more or less still relative to the ice, and a thin layer of cold meltwater sits against the face and insulates it. The moment you put a line on it and pull, that stops. Now you are forcing water past the ice at 3 knots, and that layer is stripped away continuously, and warmer water is delivered to the face over and over for as long as you keep pulling. Engineers call it forced convection, and it is the same reason a wind chill takes heat out of you faster than still air at the same temperature. They had been forcing warmer seawater across the front of that berg for 40 hours. And melting is what makes a berg roll. A berg is upright because its center of mass and its center of buoyancy are arranged in a way that keeps it upright, and as it melts, those 2 things move. The leading face was melting faster than everything else, so the mass was coming off asymmetrically. And there is a point which nobody can predict from outside where the geometry stops working. I am not saying that Berg would have stood for another year if they had left it alone. It was rotten already, which is how the animal got into it in the first place. I am saying that the tow was not a neutral act. They spent 2 days accelerating the exact process that was going to open the ice. The decision to bring it home is the reason it got out. There is no version of this story where that is not true, and it is the part Rask has never really got past. Here is what happened. As far as anybody can reconstruct it from the log, the winch trace, and 3 accounts that agree on the order of events and disagree about how long any of it took. The first thing was the tension. The winch trace shows the load coming off. Not a break and not a snap. The tension falls away over something like 9 seconds, which is the signature of a towed object that has started to move in a direction other than the one you are pulling it in. The man on watch called it as the line parting, because that is the ordinary explanation. And if you are on a boat at 20 past 2 in the morning and the tow goes slack, that is what it is, 19 times out of 20. The second thing was the sound. Every account mentions the sound, and none of them agree on how to describe it. The word that comes up most often is not a crack, and it is not a boom. It is the word grinding. 1.5 million tons of ice rotating in seawater does not go bang. It groans, and it keeps groaning for far longer than you would expect. The third thing was the wave. When a berg that size turns over, it does not just move ice. It moves the water the ice was occupying, and the water has to go somewhere, and it goes outward in a single, low, fast swell that does not look like much until it reaches you. The Meridian was lying almost stern onto it with slack line, which is close to the worst attitude she could have been in. She was lifted, and she was pushed, and she went over far enough that the deck edge went under. She did not capsize. Factory trawlers are heavy, and they have a lot of stability designed into them, and she came back up. But she went far enough over to put everything on that deck into the water, and at 20 past 2 in the morning, there were 4 men on that deck. There should not have been. That is one of the details that the incident file does record, and records fairly, and it is one of the reasons the file reads the way it does. 4 men on an open deck at 2 in the morning during a tow is more than you need. They were there because of the ice. They were there because for 2 days the most interesting thing any of them had ever seen was on the end of a rope, and men had been finding reasons to be out there in the dark and look at it. Rask was one of the 4. He went into the water on the low side, and he came up inside the lee of the hull, which is almost certainly why he is alive. The other 3 went in further out. Now I have to tell you what the camera got, because the camera is the reason we are having this conversation at all, and because what it got is very short and very poor. Rask did not film any of this. Rask was in the water. The camera that matters is the one that was already running, wedged in the rail housing on the starboard side, because he had left it there on time-lapse, pointing at the berg. It was pointing at the berg because that is where the interesting thing was. Which means when the berg rolled and the ice came apart, and the water where the ice had been filled with everything that had been inside it, the camera was pointing directly at it. The footage is 14 seconds long. For the first 6 of those seconds, the frame is ice and spray, and the horizon going where a horizon should not go. And then the vessel comes back up, and the frame steadies, and there is open water where a berg used to be, and there is something in it. Here is what makes those 8 seconds different from everything else in this story. There is no ice between the camera and the animal? None. The thing that was the strongest argument against every observation these men made, the one I said was winning at the end of the second day, is gone. It is not in the ice anymore. It is alongside a hull. And a hull is not a piece of glacial ice with an unknown refractive index and an unknown thickness. A hull is a manufactured object with a length that is written on a public registry and has been since the boat was built. 241 feet. Anybody can look that up. I did. And so did several people who wanted to prove me wrong, and it is the same number every time. In those 8 seconds, the animal runs down the side of that hull at the surface, from roughly the stern gantry to roughly the forward end of the working deck, and it is in frame, whole, from nose to the top of the tail. It is not a fin. It is not a shadow. It is a body against a measured object in open water, and you can hold a ruler up to your own screen and do this yourself. The length that falls out of that is not less than 60 feet. I want to say that carefully, because the number is doing a lot of work and it has to be honest. Not less than 60 feet. It could be more. 60 feet is the floor, because that is the shortest the animal can possibly be given what is measurable against the hull, and every source of error in that measurement makes it longer rather than shorter, because the animal is further from the camera than the near side of the hull is. 60 feet is about 18 meters. Now, here is where all of this has been going, and here is where I want you to check your own answer against the crew's. Earlier, I asked you to tell me what you thought was in that ice. I asked before there were any numbers, because I wanted to know where you would stop. The crew stopped somewhere. Every one of them on that deck over 2 days went down the same list that you almost certainly went down. It was rock until it moved. It was a whale, and that was a good answer, because whales genuinely do get trapped in ice off Greenland, and there is a word in the local language for it. That answer died on the shape of the tail, because a whale's tail is horizontal and works up and down, and the thing in that ice had a tail that stood vertically and swept side to side. That is not a fine distinction, and you do not need to be a biologist to see it. It is the difference between a mammal and a fish, and it is visible in the footage. So then it is a shark, and now the list gets shorter and better. The basking shark is the good answer, and I want to give it its due, because it is the answer I would have reached for. Basking sharks are enormous. They are the second largest fish in the world. They reach well over 30 feet. They live in cold water in the North Atlantic, and they turn up off Norway and Iceland, and they are entirely at home in a cold sea. A basking shark in Davis Strait is not an outrageous suggestion. It dies on 2 things. The first is proportion. A basking shark is a filter feeder, and it is built like one, which means an enormous gaping head and a body that tapers away behind it into something surprisingly slight. The animal in the footage is built the other way around. It is thick through the middle, it is heavy in the shoulder, and its head is small relative to its body rather than the reverse. That is the shape of an animal that hits things. The second is simply the number. Not less than 60 feet is comfortably past the largest basking shark ever reliably measured, and it is past it by a margin that no measurement error is going to close. And then there is one answer left, and it is the one that almost everybody arrives at eventually, and it is the reason I made you commit before I gave you any numbers. A great white. Of course, a great white. It is the right shape. It is a lamnid, so it is warm-bodied, and it can be in that water. It is thick through the middle and small in the head and built to hit things. Everything about the animal in that footage says great white, except one thing. The largest great white anybody has ever reliably measured is somewhere around 20 feet. There are bigger claims, and there always have been, and the honest position on those claims is that the ones with actual measurements attached to them keep coming in under 21. 60 feet is not a large great white. 60 feet is 3 great whites. And that is the entire argument. That is what the ice was hiding, and that is what the hull gave away. And that is why the last 8 seconds of a 14-second clip matter more than everything else the Atlantic Meridian brought home. I said I would come back to your answer, and here it is. If you got to Great White and stopped, you did exactly what the crew did, and you did exactly what I did the first time I watched it. The Great White is not a stupid answer. It is the best available answer, right up until somebody puts a ruler next to the thing, and nobody ever gets to put a ruler next to the thing. Except once. By accident. Because 4 men were towing a piece of ice. They got 3 men out of the water. Rask came up in the lee of the hull and got a line. 2 others were recovered within about 4 minutes, which in that water is fast, and which is the reason they lived. The 4th was a deckhand named Axel Brandt. He was 24, and it was his 3rd season. I am not going to sensationalize what happened to him, and there is nothing on any camera that shows it. What there is the last part of the 14 seconds. The frame steadies, and the animal runs down the hull, and there are men in the water off the starboard quarter, and the shape turns. And the file ends there. Not because anybody cut it. Because the vessel rolled back the other way, and the camera went under, and it stopped. When it starts again, it is daylight, and somebody is holding it, and there is nothing on the screen but grey water. The count was wrong by then. I have thought a great deal about whether to say anything else about Axel Brandt, and I have decided that the only thing worth saying is that he was a real person with a family who did not get an explanation. What his family got was the file. And this is the thing that I keep circling back to, and the reason this story has stayed with me longer than most of them. There is no cover-up here. Nobody lied. There is no agency sitting on a report. There is no officer who leaned on anybody. There is no missing evidence. The investigation happened, it was competent, and its conclusion was that a rotting iceberg under tow rolled without warning, that the resulting wave laid the vessel over, that 4 crew entered the water and 3 were recovered, and that a man was lost in circumstances consistent with cold water immersion. Every single line of that is true. The tow was ill-advised, and the file says so. 4 men on deck at night was unnecessary, and the file says so. If you handed that file to a marine investigator today, they would sign it. It is a complete, accurate, professional account of an accident. It is simply an account of an accident involving an iceberg. The animal is not in it, and the animal does not need to be in it, because the animal is not what the file is about. That is the most effective way to bury something that I have ever come across. And the reason it is so effective is that it is not an attempt to bury anything. Nobody has to keep a secret when the truth is already a complete explanation. Rask left the industry 2 years later. He has spoken about the incident 4 times that I know of, and he has never once claimed to know what it was. That is the thing about him that I find most credible. He will describe the movement in the ice, and he will describe the 8 seconds, and if you push him to name it, he says the same thing every time, which is that he is not a scientist, and he saw what he saw. The footage went to 2 universities. Both responses are polite, and both say a version of the same thing, which is that the material is interesting, that the conditions make measurement unreliable, and that without physical evidence, there is nothing further they can do with it. I have no criticism of that at all. It is the correct institutional answer. 14 seconds of handheld video from a rolling deck is not evidence in the sense that a scientist means the word, and a serious person is not going to stake anything on it. But it is worth being clear about what that answer is and what it is not. It is not a finding that there was nothing there. It is a finding that they cannot proceed. Those are very different sentences, and they get reported as if they were the same one. The berg is gone. That is the part that ends the story, whether anybody likes it or not. Whatever was left of it after the roll broke up over the following weeks in the Labrador Current, and every piece of ice that had ever been part of it was water by the end of the year. There is nothing to go back to. There is no sight. There is a position in Davis Strait where a berg used to be, and a winch tension trace, and a set of survey numbers confirmed by a professional who will not talk about anything except the numbers, and photographs taken by a passing freighter master who thought he was looking at a rock, and 14 seconds of video that includes 8 seconds nobody can explain. And there is a door. That is the last thing I want to leave you with, because people finish these films and ask where it went, as if that is a hard question. Davis Strait is not a room. It is a channel. It runs north into Baffin Bay, and it runs south into the Labrador Sea, and the Labrador Sea runs into the North Atlantic, and the North Atlantic is a quarter of the surface of this planet, and most of it is deeper than anybody has ever looked. The animal did not need to go anywhere clever. It only had to keep swimming in a cold, food-rich, almost completely unobserved ocean, which is the thing it is apparently built to do. We got one look at it, not because anybody was searching, not because of an expedition or a survey or a research program with a grant and a plan. We got one look because a piece of ice rotted in the wrong place, and a crew made a decision they should not have made, and a camera was left running on a rail pointing in the right direction. That is the whole of it. One measurement, taken by accident, by men who were trying to move some ice. And the reason it is worth anything at all is that they were not trying to measure an animal. They were trying to bring something home.